Namaste everyone, welcome to the 6-part series on the contemplative arts and aesthetics of yoga. I'm your host, Dr. Praveena Rodriguez. I'm faculty at Starr King School for the Ministry in Oakland, California, and postdoctoral fellow at the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University in Berkeley, California. In this 6-part series, we look at the application of eco-spirituality and eco-psychology through the lens of rasa theory and its integration in topographies like forests, rivers, sound, in pilgrimage, fine arts of rangoli, yantra, and maṇḍala. I'm super excited to introduce today's speaker. We have with us Rachna Nivas. Rachna Nivas is an artist, choreographer, educator, and activist in Indian classical dance, bringing a relevant voice to Kathak, deemed charismatic and revelatory by the San Francisco Chronicle and featured in 2021 by Dance magazine. She is one of the most sought-after Kathak artists and educators of her generation. She is a founding artist and artistic director of Leela Dance Collective, a nationally based women-led and artist-led collective producing powerful works by forward-thinking trailblazers in Kathak dance. Rachna's original works include her collaboration Speak, which brings together leading women in Kathak and tap, bridging Indian and African American art and heritage, along with co-creators Reena Mehta, Michelle Dorrance, and Dormitia. Rachna is also co-creator of the large-scale dance ballad Son of the Wind, featuring 20 dancers and a live orchestra. Her original solo work, Mira, was featured at the ODC Walking Distance Festival in San Francisco and at Salvatore Capizio Theater in New York City. Her original work, Stir, choreographed for Leela Youth Dance Company, was featured at the Worldwide Women's Girls Festival. I'm not going to attempt to read all of her accomplishments here, including her many awards, but for the sake of our audience, just know that we are in the presence of a celebrity. Namaste and welcome, Rachna. Rachna will be in conversation with our in-house celebrity, Dr. Rita Sherma. Dr. Rita Sherma is founding director and associate professor at the Center for Dharma Studies, co-doctoral faculty, department chair of theology and ethics, and co-chair of Sustainability 360 initiative at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Formerly, she was the Swami Vivekananda visiting professor in Hindu studies at USC Los Angeles. Dr. Sherma is co-founder of the American Academy of Religion's Hinduism Program Unit. She is the founding vice president of the Dharma Academy of North America, a scholarly society for research on Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain religious studies. Dr. Sherma also serves as vice president of the Society for Hindu-Christian Studies. She has authored, edited, and co-edited numerous books. I will again not attempt to list all of those here, but most importantly, she is the founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of Dharma Studies. So welcome, Dr. Sherma. Namaste. It's wonderful to have you both here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So the structure for today's program is we will have Rachna present a short snippet from her performance, and then Dr. Sherma and Rachna will be in conversation on the topic of contemplative arts and aesthetics of dance. However, before we begin, I would like to ask you, Dr. Sherma, if you would like to say a few words.
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. So we are delighted to be here with Rachna Nivas, and our project is a project that is funded and supported by the Oberoi Foundation for Religious Studies. Project is Contemplative Arts and Aesthetics of Yoga. Yoga in this case is broadly understood to include the practices, principles, ethics, and contemplative praxis of the traditions that emerged in ancient India. The aesthetics that arise from yoga may be ancient or may be medieval in their origins. Today, we have the good fortune of having with us an exponent of Kathak dance, one of the major classical forms of Indian dance. And the way that we need to look at this is that nothing in the world of contemplative aesthetics and arts of yoga is static. Everything is dynamic. And so Kathak has moved through various historical periods and picked up many different aspects and nuances from those periods and the people whom they came into contact with, the kathakaras. Kathak itself comes from the word kathakar. Kathā is, of course, the Sanskrit word for speech about the sacred texts, particularly the Puranas, the narrative theology texts of the Hindu tradition. And these kathakars, they wandered across North India, telling stories, but also communicating the stories via music and dance and songs. And this early genre then further developed during the bhakti movement and sort of exploded in its beauty, complexity, and in terms of its rhythmic foot movements, hand gestures, facial expressions, eye work, all of this incorporates legends from classical and ancient mythology, and of course the great Indian epics, the two major epics of Mahabharata and the Ramayana. But Kathak is especially associated with the life of Sri Krishna and became very popular in the Mughal courts of North India and the kingdoms, and especially during the Moghul Dynasty. New ways of understanding and expressing Kathak started to form during this history and evolution. So what started very much as not just a contemplative practice is an interesting thing, because a contemplative practice can be something done in isolation, in solitude. But a contemplative practice in the Hindu sense can also be liturgical, it can be communitarian. Guy Beck has written this wonderful book called Sonic Theology, in which he talks about this idea of kīrtana, sankirtan, being a contemplative praxis, but that is done in community. So I want to now talk about the roots of this dance, which begins as a way of connecting the audience with the storyteller, the kathakar. And between them is formed this sense of transmission. And the transmission is a story, but it's the transmission of a sacred narrative. And in that sacred narrative is carried a theology. And therefore, Kathak became very early on a way of sacred storytellers connecting with communities in this communitarian contemplative aesthetic. So I would like to now welcome our guest, Rachna Nivas, and I would like for her to talk to us a little bit about the history of Kathak as she has experienced it.
Sure. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, Dr. Sharma, of Kathak. It's really neat to, sit and listen to you describing Kathak from your, lens and what you have studied and the knowledge that you have, and from, this particular angle of it being contemplative and these so many other aspects. So anyways, thank you. I learned a lot while listening to you as well. So yeah, there's so many aspects of the history to talk about. Is there is there something in particular that you would want me to focus on?
So I'm thinking the Lucknow Gharana, which is very well known,
Yeah.
was founded by Ishwari Prasad.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a devotee, a Krishna devotee, a bhakta. And I believe he lived in southeast UP.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the legend goes that Lord Krishna came into his dreams and instructed him to develop a dance form as a form of worship. And so he taught the dance form to his sons, 3 of them. I don't have all of their names handy, who then taught it to their descendants and so forth.
Right.
And this tradition went on for several generations, maybe 6, 7 generations, carrying forward, this rich legacy, that is well acknowledged as the Lucknow Gharana of Kathak by Indian literature, on music, but both by Muslims and Hindus. And then, this development of Kathak during the era of Bhakti predominantly focused on the legends of Sri Krishna and Srimati Radharani. And so it's partially focused on the Bhagavata Purana, but I know that it's also influenced by texts coming in from other sources, like Gita Govinda from Bengal. And then you have the improvisation in the Mughal era. And here is where I want you to talk a little bit about it. I want you to sort of illuminate how it changes in the Mughal era, and what way does it change?
Yes, absolutely. So, something that, first of all, what you see today of Kathak, it most closely resembles what was being practiced during the Mughal era. It's a 2,000-year-old dance form. There are scriptures of it in the Natya Shastra, but we don't fully know exactly what the art form looked like. And as Dr. Sharma had spoken about, coming from kathakars, right, who were traveling, right, from village to village and telling these stories. But what we practice today most closely resembles what was really developed during the Mughal era, on top of what was the history of what the art form had already brought into that period. And that is that, while there were these stories, and while, there was absolutely, as Dr. Sharma beautifully spoke about, that there was such a particular focus on Sri Krishna. We even say another name for Kathak dance is Natavar Nritya, dance of Lord Krishna. So that was so, deeply brought in to the courts. At the same time, what many of the artists brought during that time was the rigor of the dance form, which was the very fast footwork and pirouettes and spins, chakras, as well as the very complex Indian classical music system, the Hindustani music, the North Indian classical music system. So the complexity, the rhythmic complexity, the math, there's a lot of math involved in it, as well as many of the nuances that got developed, like, in Kathak, especially if we do a solo performance, for example, one of the first things we do is a tat, which is an exploration of the tal, but it is also a tuning of the mind and the body using aesthetics of the body to do it. So like gardan and nigah, eyes, eyebrows, wrist movements, flourishes, and ending in stances. This is very emblematic of Kathak dance. And these things were all developed during the Mughal period. It adds a mystery and absolutely a contemplation, and there's a great deal of improvisation interplaying with live musicians, which was so present in that era, because musicians and dancers were not separate; they were one. The courts had hundreds of musicians that were housed and fed and commissioned to do work. Artists were, there was a patronage system for art in that era, which we were very jealous of now. But, it was really a time where music and dance were one, absolutely one. So that was when this aspect of Kathak dance was really developed, this interplay between music and dance, improvisation, and many of these things that I was mentioning. So
would you say that essentially what begins with very simple musical instruments by traveling bands of yogis and contemplatives, and more developed by a more sophisticated style coming from the Lucknow Gharana, becomes a high art form in the Mughal court. And that's where the clothing changes from traditional Indian clothing to the Persian influenced clothing, and the swirling, which is notable because the swirling is obviously coming from, for example, a Sufi source, Persian.
That's what I have, certainly read about, and that's what does seem to be, the case. Yeah.
And so what happens from what you're telling me is that it complexifies it in terms of its aesthetic qualities,
Yes.
particularly because of the access to the wider range of Indian classical instruments. And therefore, the choreography could change because of that availability. Right?
Yeah, I think I'm sure there were many factors, right? I think absolutely a kind of ascension to a higher art, I think, was possible, both with these more sophisticated instruments. Also, it's being brought into a decadent, court where there are resources as well for, I think, it to really thrive and flourish and become this more refined form. So I think there was that, there was it was a very romantic time in many ways. I mean, I know there are many things that were not romantic as well, but as far as the arts were concerned, right, it was a lot of there being space for these artists to make art, in a very purely with the senses, right? In this very sensuous environment, right? Food and indulgence in the human senses. And I think that that also aided in its ability to kind of grow into this more sophisticated higher art.
So it's
Which,
like,
sorry, I just wanted to mention, which, you know, without getting too political about anything at all, because I know that's not the point of this class, but which is interesting to juxtapose with the fall of the Mughal Empire, what happened to the form, because it went from being for the very rich to the very poor. It wasn't for anyone in the middle for many years after the fall of the Mughal period. So, yeah.
so it seems to me that it's like a knife, it cuts both ways. So that the association with the Mughal court gave it a lot of richness in terms of aesthetics, in terms of its musical interpretation, its choreography, and so forth. But also it exposed it to a gaze that was not a contemplative gaze, that was not a devotional gaze, that was not necessarily a spiritual gaze.
I think it was both. That's the interesting thing, right? I think,
But
yeah.
you could have it exposed it to that, but
Right.
it also continued to be an expression of a spiritual art form at the same
Yes.
time.
Yes.
Now, what I'm hearing you say is that the disadvantage, the real disadvantage of this is that the fall of the Mughal dynasty meant the fall of the royal patronage, and it was devastating for the artists and the art form. But in a way, it picked itself up again during the British period. And could you tell us a little bit about that? Because
Yeah, sure.
I
Yes.
want to get to what it means for young girls today who
Yes.
are in the diaspora.
No, absolutely. I'm so glad that you're focusing on that. So it's what happened is, you know, I think a lot of folks don't really know what happened, and so I love to talk about it. So part of the Mughal dynasty were courtesans, right? Which were in a lot of ways very powerful women. They were the ultimate authority on dance, music, etiquette, and really were of the upper echelon of society. There are actually records, tax records today, of many of these women owning property in the 1700s. So, which is very, I mean, you know, very unheard of. So when I say they were relatively powerful, they really were, especially for that time. What happened during when British rule began is that the kings were dethroned. So actually, the last Nawab of Lucknow, Wajid Ali Shah, was the great patron of Kathak dance. When he was dethroned, he took his entire court and went to the outskirts of Kolkata. So the whole court continued to make art underground. So there were many other courts and lineages that died. We don't even necessarily fully know about. Many didn't survive. But this particular one, which became the Lucknow Gharana, really speaking, underground during British rule, because actually it was publicly banned from performance. There was an anti-Nach movement of 1880, actually, where dance was not even allowed to be performed. It was replaced by Western dance forms like ballroom dancing, etc. So, so that was what was happening. Sadly, the women who were courtesans actually ended up going into sex work during the British rule time for survival. And so it was this very juxtaposition of high art being practiced in these very poor poor neighborhoods, in prostitute quarters. That was happening. It's a very, very unique phenomenon that such high art was being practiced in those neighborhoods. So that went on, and the way in which I would say that things evolved eventually was that as we started getting closer to Indian independence in the 1920s and 30s, there started to be a revival and a renaissance of reclaiming Indian values and traditions as part of the movement for gaining independence. And that was when there was an opening for these art forms to start being able to be out in the open again, and to, there to be something. Sadly, we lost 150 years of it being out. And of there being a knowledge base and an appreciation for it, which is what, we're still struggling for today. That's really an imprint, a very big imprint on the history of the form. And what is very palpable continues to be palpable today, and is part of why I've devoted my life to this art form. But I would say, as it's, in this Renaissance and this revival, which is where my Guruji always says he was born at the right time at the right place, because it was in Kolkata in the 1940s when there was this, there was a lot of focus on trying to bring back these forms. And so he grew up in his parents' school. My Guruji is Pandit Chitresh Das, and his parents actually had the first Indian government-funded arts institution, Nritya Bharati in Kolkata. So where they had dance, classical dance, music, and fine art, and all of the 8 Indian classical dance forms masters would come through there. So that's a big reason why, when he ended up migrating to the US, which is what ended up happening by a lot of these artists in the 1970s, many of these master artists of that generation, who were still products of the leftover patronage system, right? They were still like from that patronage system, but came to the West looking for more opportunity in the 1970s. And the San Francisco Bay Area is actually a very, very historic place for another renaissance of Indian classical art. I would say that happened, which was in the 70s because of Ustad Ali Akbar Khan Sahab. And he established the Ali Akbar College of Music in Berkeley, actually in the 1960s, then moved the college to Marin because of a lot of the protests and riots that were happening for Vietnam War. He said, this is no place for art. It was too much. So he moved everything to Marin County, and that was where many of the master artists of that generation, came from India, including my own Guruji. And so that kind of brings us to a little bit more of, why these forms, why I'm, later became a product of, my Guruji's vision to bring it to the South Asian community, which was a whole other, era when the Indian diaspora started kind of exploding. So I don't know how much you want me to go into, connecting it to stuff today, but, oh, I think you're on mute.
I think that what has happened is a very strange thing. My daughter, when she was very little, she was 5.5, and she started taking Kathak. And it was in the home of a very well-known teacher, actually, in Southern California at the time. And she would always do a puja when all the girls gathered. She would do a puja, a Krishna Vandana, and then she would start their practice. So eventually my daughter went away and went into Bharatanatyam, and so as we moved, but to her and to all of these girls growing up during this period, today's diaspora, children, it's again become a contemplative practice. which is fascinating. How the spiral is a really interesting historic issue.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's both, and there is a tricky kind of thing happening because on one hand, right, Kathak basically started being performed on the proscenium stage, right, and which is wonderful because it brings it forth to people of all walks of life, and as something that everybody can appreciate and benefit from. And I would say that performance in general is not necessarily contemplative. I would say that it can be, but it is actually an act of communion to perform. And the way that I see performance is that way. But I was lucky that was grilled into me by my guru.
So Rachna, I'm going to ask you a direct question.
Yes.
The thing is that religion is a construct that was brought into India by the British, and it complexified everything. But we are now stuck with it, and it's problematic, especially when we're looking at the arts and aesthetics of India in their global iterations and expressions. Because I want to compare this, and you can correct me if you don't think it's a proper comparison, but when I think of something like mindful walking or any of the things that have come to us through contemplative traditions, that whether it's mindfulness or posture yoga, asana, people are practicing it as forms of exercise, forms of concentration for higher productivity, and so forth. Athletes are doing the both for better athletic performance. But for many people who are not religious, it is essentially a spiritual practice. It's essentially what we would call yoga, in the sense that it's an embodied praxis which connects you to something higher than yourself, and at the same time, deeply to your own embodiment.
Yes.
And in that way, it's a contemplative practice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's how I treat it. That's how I teach it. In fact, the first thing I say when people come to my class is, if you are here so that you can video yourself doing an item and post it on Instagram, you're in the wrong place. And everybody usually stays. And the reason why I want to say everybody stays, because I keep grilling this, constantly. I grill it constantly and say that is not the purpose. I didn't say that you can't have that. I have videos on Instagram of myself. But the point is that that's not the purpose or the intent of it. And everybody always stays, which is always what is very interesting to me, because actually that is what people want if you guide that. And that is absolutely what this forum was meant to be. That was its original purpose. And that is what it continues to be if your intention is in that place. So yes, 100%.
I think you can be not religious, but you have to be contemplative.
So this is what I also say. And what I believe very fundamentally. because people ask me if this art form is religious. My answer is not really. Because you don't even have to believe in God to do this form. But what you cannot do is that you cannot separate the deities of various of the Indian of the civilization of the Indian subcontinent from this dance form. Separate, because that is such a big part of the intention of the form, which is that these are beautiful personifications of sophisticated philosophies of the human psyche, of human behavior, of human life. So what we do as dancers is we don't worship these deities. I mean, if you want to, you can, but that's not what we do. We become them. And becoming them is very different from worshiping them. We have to understand their essence and what is every hand and every arm and every story. What is the purpose of it? And in order to become them, you have to actually feel deeply in your body and in your psyche what that means. So separating the two is not possible, because it ultimately is a spiritual act of finding your higher self, finding a higher power through this act. Yeah.
Well, I want to connect it to the notion of ritual in the first place, that, in the Indic world, and I use the term dharma traditions, and not in a political way, but the fact is that for Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism, this term is heavy and pregnant with meaning. And the highest concept in Buddhism is dharmakaya, the body of truth, the body of reality. And what we have in the rituals of the Buddhist world, I mean, it's a non-theistic tradition, but the idea of being deeply focused in, those rituals of Vajrayana or of Mahayana or Theravada Buddhism is about deep concentration. It is, in a sense, meditation. So when we say, do mindfulness, focus on your breath, well, you can focus on your breath and your mind might be thinking of 5,000 things.
Right.
Keep bringing
right.
But if you're doing Kathak and you don't focus, you'll fall flat on your backside.
That's absolutely right.
It elicits a meditative focus, and it can lead much more easily than walking, breathing, and so forth meditations that are secular now, to what Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, who was a professor at my alma mater, Claremont Graduate University, has called flow.
Yes. It's 100%. It's meditation in motion. Your body is in complete motion, but your mind has to be still. It has to be. No part of you is resting, not from your pinky finger to your toe. And if you are able to start, and this is what I also tell my students, if your mind is wandering while you're doing something, then it means that you got to move on to the next something, that you have to challenge yourself to something more, because you should not be able to think about anything else when you are dancing. You have to be fully in it. And even if you take something, even if you break down technique wise something very specific, like our chakras, the pirouettes, right? In Kathak, we can do 108 spins straight. I have one of my dynamite teenagers right now. She can do 200. She can do 200 without flinching, and like fast. 1, 2, 3, 4, like this. So, wow. And of course, when they first start learning, you have to focus on a spot on the wall. We put a little red dot, but when you're in performance, there's no dot. Where are you spotting? It's often blackness. The spot is your third eye. Your spot is inside you, which is, and it comes at a certain point, once you know how to do the technique, it's all mental fortitude. It is all about your concentration and focus. And what is most powerful is that when you end it, and I always, talk about this because in sports, you end it and, they collapse and they breathe heavily and take big gulps of water. We don't do that in dance. We can't do that. We end it and then we have to hold it. And when you're holding that position, you have encapsulated the power, you have kept with you the power of your concentration. You have not released it out. It's here and you're walking around with it. When you leave the room, when you're leaving the rehearsal room or the practice room or the performance, it's here. It's very powerful to have that kind of spiritual capital.
Beautifully said. We would like to invite you now to share with us some clips, if you have, if you're interested in doing that.
Yeah. I am happy to share some, I'm going to share this clip that I mentioned about tat, which is which is really from the courts. I'll share that. And then if there's time, I can share a little snippet of the collaboration of how we kind of venture with other forms, but okay. So this, I can just show a little bit because this is really going into the focus and the meditative aspect. So that's just a little bit there. I'm just gonna fast forward to some stuff here and show a little bit of, oh, I think that's good. Yeah. You know, this, I actually have a little snippet from the GTU performance that I did that I thought would be cool to show because it's
that was beautiful. Beautiful.
the interaction. That's all I have. I don't know, Praveenaji, you wanted to show that 1 minute trailer just to give a little.
Yes, it's actually one of my favorites, and I would love to share that. So.
That's all. That's a little brief.
I just wanted to mention that that trailer is from Son of the Wind, and it is it is a remarkable achievement and is based on the epic Ramayana. Dr. Rodriguez, did you have questions or comments?
Yes, actually, I do. Yeah, what actually I was deeply moved by, what you shared earlier on, about holding that power and also what Dr. Sherma, just to connect to what Dr. Sherma said about this, the ritual aspect of the dance. And it actually reminded me of puja, because during one of the pujas, and I'm sure there are different ways of doing it, but you have these bija mantras, and one of the chants, after you've chanted the bija mantras, you say prana iha prana, which means you are the life of this life. And then another part you say jiva iha stita, which means you are now situated within this life. You are all of my organs, sarvendriyani, and then at the time of visarjan, you're not really getting rid of that power. You're still holding it within yourself. So I was deeply moved by that aspect, and also I could see like traces of how this dance could actually be a basically a ritual in performance. 108. Yeah, that's just amazing to me. And I'm sure we can go on and on about this, but but I really wanted to thank you for your time, and also for your patience as we coordinated with all the logistics and everything.
Oh,
Yeah,
of
so
course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm also, it's really, like I said, it's really nice to always bridge with academia, because it's also to hear and to talk about the form from this lens is really, I learn things too. So
yeah, this is
yeah.
wonderful. Actually, I had an offbeat question, and I'm not sure exactly, what the answer would be, because it seems like with with Western education in India, it seems like some of these dance forms, and some of the, because these dance forms contain knowledge systems, and unfortunately they are not being incorporated into into current forms of academia in India. And I mean, now of course you can probably get a PhD in dance, but it's still not as popular as getting a PhD, in philosophy, in Hindu philosophy or theology. And I feel like, I mean, literally, you are a doctor in your own right. You know what I mean? So how do you feel like this dance form, or this art is basically being lost, or is not being acknowledged, or is there a way for it to get recognized, in academia? um, what do you think? What are your thoughts about that?
It's a great question. I am an American born Indian, and my parents are immigrants and came. My dad came in 1967, and he came on a scholarship to UC Berkeley, and I went to UC Berkeley, by the way, too. Just, I don't know if I made that clear, so go Bears. um, but I wanted to, what I'm saying is that for me to become an Indian classical dancer by profession was not at all in anybody's plans here, right? I grew up in the Bay Area in a typical middle class, Indian household and South Asian household. And so, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because of what compelled me to have to renegotiate my own indoctrination of doing what is a respectable profession, in our, culture. Um, what made me really, go past that, to think much past that, is because I felt very angry and continue to, which drives me in a good way. So it's not like a negative thing necessarily. That so few South Asians knew about what is involved and what is behind Indian classical art. I felt I feel a great sense of responsibility and passion to bring light to that, because all these forms are so incredible in what they offer, not just in the past, but today. These forms are, often it is said that they are, oh, it's archaic and, they need to be updated. They are being updated.
You've done that yourself. I mean, this video that we watched and speak.
Right. But even beyond that, classical form is the only thing that has truly survived. It has survived wars, regime changes, colonization, and migration to another continent. It has truly survived, right? And the only way to survive is to evolve by its environment, right? It's just that the evolution is not happening in 1 week and 2 weeks and 3 weeks or 1 year or 5 years. The evolution happens over a much larger span of time. So I would say that, it is lost in a lot of ways. Yes, there is that aspect of it, there being that. And even more so because the masters, who I said were the last generation who benefited from the patronage system, which is my Guruji's generation, right? We are losing all of those masters every day. Every day a new, one of these masters is passing away. They're all, So, I think that this is why it's so wonderful that, you are, even bringing people like me to do things like this, because I just feel so proud of these forms. And Dr. Sharma had spoken so beautifully about, I can't even remember the choice of words that she had used to talk about these practices, yoga, so many of them that were birthed in the Indian subcontinent, and there's so much behind them. Their intention of what they are meant to do and how they bring actualization to us as humans on this earth. And that can be universal. It can be practiced by anybody, right? It doesn't have to be practiced by an Indian. That's the beauty of it. It's birthed there. It doesn't have to be practiced. So, I think that yes, there does need to be, much more widespread knowledge. That you talked about the knowledge system. That knowledge needs to be more. That's my work. That's really fundamentally what my work is to help bring that.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience, with the logistics and everything. And also thank you, Dr. Sharma. You can find Rachna Nivas on rachnanivas.com, and you can find Dr. Sharma on ritasherma.com. Thank you for watching, everyone. Namaste.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez.
Yeah. Namaste.
Namaskar.